A black executive steps off a private jet, her demeanor calm and poised, ready to attend a high-stakes business meeting that could shape the future of her company. But when she encounters the plane's captain, everything changes. Without reason, he dismisses her presence, refusing basic courtesies and escalating tensions throughout the flight. Just minutes after landing, a message arrives that not only ends his career but sends ripples through the aviation industry in a way no one could have anticipated. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from today. And if stories of resilience and justice inspire you, be sure to subscribe for more. The sun hung low, sinking behind the horizon as if retreating from a world it no longer wanted to watch. The tarmac shimmered in the golden haze of dusk, a quiet stage where power moved not with force, but in whispers. There was a private jet, sleek and silver, poised to take flight. Its metal surface caught the light, a mirror to a world where privilege gleamed but often cast long shadows. Captain Henry, Hank, Warren stood at the base of the stairs. His posture sharp as if he had been carved from stone. His chin tilted just high enough to make it clear he believed he owned this moment. He wore his uniform with an air of entitlement. The polished buttons and stiff cap not just symbols of his authority but shields for the man underneath, a man whose view of the world had been locked in place long ago. He tapped his watch, the metallic click sharp against the ambient hum of the idling engines. Late, he muttered under his breath, his voice low but clipped. Figures. Behind him, the cabin crew exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. Hank's reputation was well known. He was a man who spoke of efficiency and discipline but carried with him an undercurrent of disdain for what he called new money. A polite euphemism for the people he thought didn't belong. In the distance, the hum of an approaching car interrupted the stillness. A black sedan, sleek as the jet itself, rolled to a stop at the edge of the tarmac. The driver stepped out, his movements fluid as he opened the rear passenger door. Out stepped Nadia Harper. She moved with a quiet authority that turned heads. The kind of presence that made people take notice without fully understanding why. Her navy trench coat fluttered slightly in the evening breeze, tailored perfectly to her slender frame. Her hair was swept back into a smooth bun, and her dark skin seemed to absorb the warm hues of the fading sunlight. She exuded a kind of elegance that didn't ask for attention, it commanded it. Beside her, her assistant Maya fumbled with a leather portfolio and a designer suitcase. Her petite frame nearly swallowed by the weight of both. They walked toward the jet, the rhythmic click of Nadia's heels echoing against the vast expanse of concrete. Hank watched them approach, his expression tightening. He didn't like the way she carried herself. As if she belonged here. As if this space, this jet, this luxury was hers to claim. She didn't even need to look at him for him to feel dismissed. Evening, Captain, Nadia said as she reached the base of the stairs. Her voice was smooth, polite, with just enough warmth to suggest she knew how to handle people like him. Hank didn't respond. He shifted his weight, stepping slightly to the side as though her words had floated past him unheard. His eyes flickered to the suitcase Maya was hauling and then back to the horizon. His silence deliberate and cutting. Maya hesitated, glancing at Nadia. Captain Warren, she ventured, her voice a bit more timid. Is everything ready for departure? Hank didn't bother to look at her. The flight is prepped, he said curtly, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. Nadia blinked, her expression betraying nothing but a faint crease in her brow. She had spent her life navigating rooms like this, spaces where she was seen but never acknowledged. It wasn't new, but it wasn't any less exhausting. Thank you, she said, her tone calm as she climbed the steps. Each movement precise, deliberate. Maya followed, her nervous energy palpable as she cast one last glance back at Hank. Inside the jet, the atmosphere shifted. The cabin was pristine, the kind of polished luxury designed to make its passengers feel untouchable. White leather seats gleamed under soft ambient lighting, and a single orchid rested in a vase near Nadia's seat. The crew greeted her warmly, their professionalism a sharp contrast to their captain's dismissiveness. Mrs. Harper, please let us know if there's anything you need, one of the attendants said, her voice steady but tinged with the unease of someone who had witnessed what had happened on the tarmac. Nadia smiled politely as she took her seat. Thank you, she replied, her tone light but firm. As she settled in, she noticed the tension in the air, the way the attendants moved a little too quickly, their eyes darting toward the closed cockpit door. Maya sat across from her, her brow furrowed. "Do you want me to file a complaint?" she asked quietly. "No," Nadia said, her voice soft but resolute. "Not yet." Maya's frown deepened. "But he was exactly who he is." Nadia interrupted gently, her eyes turned toward the window, watching as the last light of the day slipped below the horizon. "Let's see how far he's willing to go." In the cockpit, Hank sat stiffly in his seat, his jaw tight. He glanced at the cabin camera feed, watching as Nadia settled in, her movements calm and composed. It irritated him. People like her always irritated him, not because they were loud or disruptive, but because they didn't need to be. Her presence alone was enough to make him feel small, and he hated that. She probably married into it. He muttered to himself, his voice low. His co-pilot, Eric, glanced at him but said nothing. The engines roared to life, the jet trembling slightly as it prepared for takeoff. Hank tightened his grip on the controls, his mind racing. He told himself it didn't matter, that she didn't matter, but the truth was, she did. Because people like Nadia Harper always mattered more than men like Hank Warren wanted to admit. The jet cut through the evening sky, its engines humming steadily against the darkness. Inside, the cabin was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels uneasy, like a held breath waiting for release. Nadia Harper sat by the window, her posture relaxed but her gaze focused on the world beyond the glass. Below, city lights scattered like fractured constellations, reminding her of how distance changes perspective. What seemed connected from one angle could dissolve into separation when viewed from another. Maya shifted in her seat across from her, her discomfort evident. She fiddled with the strap of her watch, her fingers restless against the soft leather. "It's not right," she murmured, breaking the silence. Nadia turned to her, one eyebrow raised in gentle inquiry. "What isn't?" "You know what I mean," Maya said, her voice hushed as though the air itself carried ears. "The way he acted back there, like we weren't even people." She shook her head, her frustration palpable. "I don't understand how you can just sit there, like it doesn't bother you." "Oh, it bothers me," Nadia replied, her tone steady. "But anger is what he wants. It would justify whatever small story he's already told himself about who we are." She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the smooth leather armrests. "People like him, they need to feel bigger than someone else. I won't give him that." Maya sighed, her expression torn between admiration and disbelief. "I couldn't do it. I'd have to say something." "You would," Nadia said with a faint smile. "And then he'd make it about you. About your emotions, your unreasonableness. People like him know how to turn defense into offense. To make it seem like you're the one out of place. But doesn't staying quiet let him win?" Maya pressed, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and glanced toward the cockpit door. Nadia's gaze softened. "Not if you understand the game. He's playing chess, Maya, but he's bad at it. He'll overreach. They always do." In the cockpit, Captain Hank Warren's hands rested lightly on the controls, though his mind wasn't on the instruments. The autopilot held steady, the systems all but running themselves, leaving Hank with little to do but stew. "She's too calm," he muttered under his breath, his words aimed at no one in particular. Beside him, Eric adjusted a dial on the control panel, pretending he hadn't heard. He had learned early in his career that silence was safer than speaking when it came to men like Hank. She didn't even flinch. Hank continued, his tone tinged with something that wasn't quite anger but not far from it. "People like that, they think they can walk into any space and act like they own it." Eric hesitated, his fingers hovering over the panel. "Sir, with all due respect, she hasn't done anything." "Exactly," Hank snapped, cutting him off. His voice carried a sharpness that filled the small cockpit. "That's the problem. It's a power play, don't you see? Sitting there like she's untouchable." Eric's brow furrowed, but he didn't respond. He could feel the tension in Hank's words, the way they carried the weight of something much older than the moment. It wasn't just about Nadia. It never was. Back in the cabin, an attendant approached, her polished smile strained at the edges. "Mrs. Harper, may I offer you something to drink?" "Just water, thank you," Nadia replied, her tone gracious. As the attendant turned to leave, Maya leaned in closer, her voice low. "Even the crew feels it." "Of course they do," Nadia said, but they're not in a position to push back. They're as trapped by the hierarchy as anyone else. Maya frowned, her fingers curling into a fist. It's not fair. It rarely is, Nadia said. She lifted her glass of water and took a slow sip. Her movements deliberate, but fairness isn't the point. The point is what we do in the face of it. As if on cue, the intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, Hank's voice rang out, clipped and professional on the surface but carrying an edge that Nadia recognized immediately. This is your captain speaking. We'd like to remind you to remain seated for the duration of the flight. Turbulence can be unpredictable. The message ended as abruptly as it had begun. Maya glanced toward the cockpit. Her frustration renewed. Turbulence? The air is smooth as glass. Nadia set her glass down. The faint chime of crystal against wood filling the silence. He's trying to make a point. What point? That he's in control, Nadia said simply. In the cockpit, Hank leaned back in his seat, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He glanced at the cabin camera feed, his eyes narrowing as he watched Nadia sitting there, unbothered, her calmness gnawed at him, her refusal to react like a mirror reflecting his own insecurities. You think you're better than me, he muttered under his breath. But you're just sitting there, playing a role. Eric shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Captain, I really think you should let it go. Let it go? Hank turned toward him, his expression incredulous. Do you have any idea what's happening here? This is about respect, about knowing your place. Eric's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Hank's gaze flicked back to the camera feed, his grip tightening on the armrest. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing something, though he couldn't name what it was. As the jet soared through the night sky, the tension grew heavier, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. Nadia felt it, the way the air seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken words and unresolved truths. Maya fidgeted in her seat, her frustration simmering just below the surface. How do you stand it? She asked finally. Because I've stood it before, Nadia said. Her voice was soft but carried a weight that settled over the cabin. And because I know something he doesn't. What's that? Nadia's lips curved into a faint smile. That the more he tries to assert his power, the more he reveals how little of it he actually has. The engines hummed steadily as the jet continued its journey. But inside, the battle was already underway. It wasn't loud or visible, but it was there, pulsing beneath the surface like a heartbeat. Nadia knew it wouldn't be long now. People like Hank always pushed too far. And when they did, they were the ones who fell. For now, she waited. The jet glided through the night sky, steady and unbroken, but inside, the atmosphere was anything but. The silence in the cabin was tense now, taut like a string stretched too far, one wrong note away from snapping. Nadia Harper sat unmoving, her calm demeanor untouched by the turbulence brewing around her. Her hands rested lightly on the armrests, her polished nails catching the dim cabin light. She had mastered this stillness long ago, knowing that her every movement was always under scrutiny in ways others could never understand. Across from her, Maya's restlessness had grown. She drummed her fingers on the edge of her tablet, her eyes darting to the closed cockpit door. He's watching us, isn't he? She asked, her voice low but sharp. Nadia followed her assistant's gaze, her own expression unreadable. Of course he is. It's sick, Maya hissed. The way he looks at us like we don't belong here. Like we're intruders in his world. It's not his world, Nadia replied evenly. That's what unsettles him. In the cockpit, Captain Hank Warren sat stiffly in his chair, his eyes locked on the small cabin camera feed. The grainy screen flickered faintly, displaying the image of Nadia and Maya seated calmly in the luxury he believed they didn't deserve. His co-pilot, Eric, broke the silence. Captain, everything's running smooth. We're holding altitude. Systems are stable. You should take a breather. Hank didn't even look at him. I don't need a break. Eric hesitated, then tried again. Sir, with respect, you seem distracted. Hank's jaw tightened. I'm not distracted. I'm focused. Eric knew better than to push. But the unease in his stomach only grew. Something wasn't right. Hank's behavior was slipping past the usual arrogance into something darker. She thinks she's untouchable, Hank muttered, almost to himself. Eric shifted in his seat. Who? Hank gestured vaguely at the screen. Her. People like her. They act like they own the place. Like they're entitled to everything. They walk into spaces that were never meant for them and just take over. Eric frowned, his discomfort now unmistakable. Captain, she's a passenger. She's not doing anything. That's the problem, Hank snapped, his voice cutting through the small cockpit. It's not what she's doing. It's how she's doing it. Sitting there like she owns the damn jet. Like she's better than me. Eric opened his mouth to respond. But no words came. What could he say? The truth was, Hank's frustration wasn't about Nadia's actions, it was about her existence. Back in the cabin, an attendant brought a fresh glass of sparkling water to Nadia, her hands trembling slightly as she set it down. Is there anything else you need, Mrs. Harper? Nadia offered her a kind smile. No, thank you. This will do. The attendant nodded quickly and retreated, her unease palpable. Maya leaned forward, lowering her voice. Even the crew is scared of him. Did you see her hands? I did, Nadia said softly. Maya's frustration bubbled over. Why does he get to act like this? Just because he's sitting in that cockpit doesn't mean he owns us. Nadia turned her gaze to the window, the faint reflection of her face merging with the endless darkness outside. The cockpit isn't the source of his power, she said after a pause. Then what is? Maya asked. Fear, Nadia replied simply, and the belief that no one will challenge him. Hank's voice crackled over the intercom again, interrupting the quiet. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his tone dripping with forced politeness. This is your captain speaking. As we approach our cruising altitude, I'd like to remind you to remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Unnecessary movement can disrupt the balance of the cabin. Maya frowned. What does that even mean? Disrupt the balance of the cabin? Is he serious? Nadia's lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes remained sharp. He's testing boundaries. Boundaries for what? For how far he can go before someone pushes back, Nadia said. In the cockpit, Hank leaned back in his chair, a smug satisfaction settling over him. He glanced at Eric, who was now visibly tense. You don't think that was a little much? Eric asked cautiously. What? Hank replied, his tone light but condescending. That announcement. It came across pointed. Hank shrugged. I'm just doing my job. If she wants to think it's about her, that's her problem. Eric shook his head but said nothing. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. But he didn't know how to push back. As the flight continued, the tension in the cabin grew. Maya could feel it like a pressure in the air, a subtle but relentless force. He's going to try something else, she said, her voice tight. Nadia glanced at her, her expression calm but knowing. He will, and when he does, it won't be subtle. What do? We wait, Nadia said, her voice carried a quiet confidence, the kind born of experience. He'll make his move, and when he does, he'll show everyone exactly who he is. Maya wanted to argue, to demand action, but something in Nadia's tone stopped her. There was a strength there that Maya couldn't deny, a sense that Nadia wasn't just enduring this moment, she was controlling it. In the cockpit, Hank's frustration boiled over. The image of Nadia on the cabin camera feed, serene and unshaken, felt like a personal affront. I'm going back there, he said suddenly, pushing himself out of his seat. Eric looked at him, alarmed. Sir, what are you doing? I'm checking on the passengers, Hank said, his tone clipped. Captain, you can't. I can and I will, Hank snapped, cutting him off. Eric watched helplessly as Hank strode toward the cabin door, his movements stiff with suppressed anger. When Hank entered the cabin, the atmosphere shifted instantly. His presence was like a storm cloud, dark and heavy, filling the space with unspoken hostility. Nadia noticed him immediately but didn't react. She remained seated, her posture composed, her gaze steady. Is there something I can help you with, Captain? She asked, her tone smooth and polite. Hank hesitated, thrown off by her calmness. For a moment, he stood there, silent, as if searching for words. I just wanted to check on my passengers, he said finally, his voice tight. Make sure everything is satisfactory. Everything is quite satisfactory, Nadia replied. Her gaze didn't waver, and her calmness felt sharper than any accusation could have. Hank's jaw clenched. He nodded curtly and turned to leave, but his retreat felt hollow. A man walking away not out of control but out of defeat. As the cockpit door closed behind him, Maya let out a shaky breath. What was that? Nadia's faint smile returned. The beginning of the end. The The plane hummed steadily through the darkened sky. A vessel carrying not just people but the weight of everything unspoken. The calm outside was deceptive. A brittle shell stretched over a growing storm. Inside, the air grew heavier with every passing moment. As if it, too, carried the weight of the unspoken truths that defined this journey. Nadia Harper remained motionless, a portrait of calm defiance. She felt the weight of Hank Warren's presence still lingering in the cabin. A residue of hostility that clung to the air like stale smoke. Across from her, Maya shifted uncomfortably, her small movements betraying her restlessness. That was something else, Maya murmured, her voice low. What was? The way he looked at you. Maya's brow furrowed as she spoke. Like you weren't even there, but also like you were the only thing he could see. Nadia tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. That's how they look at anything that makes them uncomfortable. They either erase it or obsess over it. But why you? Maya pressed, frustration lacing her voice. You haven't done anything to him. That's exactly why, Nadia replied. It's not about what I've done. It's about what I represent. To him, I'm not a person. I'm a challenge. Maya's jaw tightened, her fingers gripping the edge of the armrest. It's not fair. Fairness has nothing to do with it, Nadia said quietly. Her voice carried a weight that stilled Maya's movements. This isn't about fairness. It's about power and who gets to decide where it belongs. In the cockpit, Hank sat rigid in his seat, his thoughts churning like a storm cloud. The camera feed still flickered on the small screen, showing Nadia seated in her pristine leather chair, calm and poised. That calmness was a provocation, a reminder of something Hank couldn't articulate but felt deeply in his bones. She thinks she's better than me, he muttered, his voice low and sharp. Eric, seated beside him, shifted uncomfortably. Captain, I really think you're making this bigger than it is. Hank turned to him, his eyes narrowing. What's that supposed to mean? Eric hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I just mean, she hasn't done anything. She's just sitting there. And that's the problem, Hank snapped. His voice was louder now, the tension spilling over. She's sitting there like she owns the place. Like she's untouchable. Eric held Hank's gaze for a moment, then looked away. He had seen men like Hank before. Men whose insecurities festered into something uglier with time. It was a pattern predictable and dangerous. In the cabin, the tension broke with the arrival of another attendant. She approached cautiously, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Mrs. Harper, she began, her voice hesitant. The captain has asked that all passengers remain seated for the remainder of the flight. He's anticipating turbulence. Maya shot up from her seat. Turbulence? It's been smooth the whole time. The attendant's cheeks flushed, and she glanced nervously at Nadia, as if seeking permission to respond. Maya, Nadia said softly, her voice cutting through the moment. It's fine. It's not fine, Maya replied, turning back to the attendant. Is there turbulence or not? The woman hesitated, her eyes darting toward the cockpit door. I'm not sure. Exactly, Maya said, her frustration boiling over. He's just doing this to mess with us. Maya, Nadia said again, her tone firmer this time. Sit down. Reluctantly, Maya obeyed, but the anger on her face was unmistakable. The attendant quickly retreated, leaving the cabin quiet once more. You're just going to let him get away with this? Maya asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. Nadia turned to her, her expression calm but unyielding. He's already losing. He just doesn't know it yet. How can you be so sure? Because the more he tries to control the situation, the less control he actually has, Nadia said. She leaned back in her seat, her gaze turning to the window. Men like him don't understand restraint. They always go too far. In the cockpit, Hank was unraveling. The quiet in the cabin, the absence of any visible reaction from Nadia, only stoked his frustration. It wasn't supposed to go this way. He had expected her to push back, to give him something to fight against. But her calmness was a mirror reflecting every crack in his carefully constructed facade. I'll bet she's married to some hedge fund guy, Hank muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. That's how these people get in. They don't earn it, they marry into it. Eric glanced at him, his discomfort growing. Captain, I think you're crossing a line. Hank ignored him, his eyes fixed on the camera feed. She probably doesn't even know how this jet works. Just sits there, drinking champagne, thinking she's better than the rest of us. Eric took a deep breath, steadying himself. Sir, I really think you should focus on flying. I am focused, Hank snapped, but someone has to put her in her place. As the jet continued its smooth flight, the tension reached a breaking point. Maya leaned forward, her voice low but urgent. Mrs. Harper, he's getting worse. What if he does something reckless? Nadia turned to her, her expression steady. That's why we stay calm. The more composed we are, the more obvious his behavior becomes. He's digging his own grave. Maya, we just have to let him finish. Maya frowned but said nothing. She wanted to trust Nadia's approach, but the simmering injustice was almost too much to bear. Hank's voice came over the intercom again, this time sharper, more condescending. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're approaching some unstable air currents. Please ensure you remain seated and secure all personal belongings. Maya rolled her eyes. Unstable air currents? He's just making this up. Nadia didn't respond. She simply folded her hands in her lap, her expression calm. In the cockpit, Eric finally spoke up, his voice firm. Captain, this has to stop. You're risking your career over what? A passenger who hasn't done anything wrong. Hank turned to him, his face flushed with anger. You don't understand. This isn't just about her. It's about what she represents. They walk into spaces they don't belong and act like they own it. Someone has to push back. Push back against what? Eric shot back. She's sitting in her seat, minding her business. You're the one acting like you own everything. The words hung in the air, cutting through Hank's anger with a sharpness that silenced him. For a moment, he stared at Eric, his jaw tightening. You don't get it, he muttered. You're too young to understand. Eric shook his head, his disappointment evident. No, Captain, I think I understand perfectly. The jet hummed on, carrying its passengers through the night. In the cabin, Nadia watched the faint glow of city lights far below, her reflection blending with the glass. He's losing control, she said softly, almost to herself. Maya looked at her, confused. What do you mean? His fear is driving him now. Nadia replied, and fear always makes people show their true selves. The hum of the engines droned steadily, a mechanical lullaby at odds with the turmoil brewing inside the jet. The smooth flight belied the tension stretching thin, ready to snap. Beneath the veneer of luxury, something fragile and human was breaking, as it often did when power met resistance it couldn't crush. Nadia Harper sat silently by the window, her reflection a ghostly echo in the glass. Below her, the world was dark and distant, a scatter of lights hinting at cities teeming with life. The cabin was still, but the air felt charged, as if waiting for a storm to break. Across from her, Maya's restlessness had grown into quiet fury. She tapped her fingers against her thigh, the sound barely audible but relentless. He's doing it again, she muttered. Doing what? Nadia asked, her voice calm. Watching us. You can feel it, can't you? Maya glanced toward the cockpit door, her jaw tight. It's like he's waiting for us to make a wrong move, something he can pounce on. He doesn't need us to make a wrong move, Nadia replied. He's already decided we don't belong. Maya's lips pressed into a thin line, her anger bubbling just beneath the surface. How can you be so calm? Nadia turned her gaze toward Maya, her expression soft but resolute. Because I've learned that people like him unravel on their own. The more I react, the more power I give him. But if I wait, she let the words hang in the air, their weight settling between them. In the cockpit, Captain Hank Warren gripped the controls tightly, his knuckles white. He didn't need to be holding them. The autopilot had the plane steady, but he couldn't bring himself to let go. His eyes flicked to the cabin camera feed again, where Nadia sat, unbothered. Her stillness enraged him in a way he couldn't explain. She's mocking me, he muttered. Eric, his company pilot, glanced at him cautiously. Captain, she hasn't said a word to you. And that's the problem, Hank snapped, his voice sharp and brittle. She's sitting there like she owns the damn place. Like she's untouchable. Eric hesitated, then spoke, his tone measured. Maybe it's not about you. Maybe she's just living her life. Hank turned to him, his expression dark. You don't understand. People like her, they think they can just walk into spaces they don't belong, take what they want, and act like the rest of us don't matter. Spaces they don't belong? Eric repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. She's a passenger, Captain. She has every right to be here. Hank didn't respond. His jaw tightened, and his grip on the controls grew even more rigid. The intercom crackled to life. breaking the cabin's fragile stillness. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hank's voice rang out, forced and tense. "This is your captain speaking. As we approach a patch of turbulent air, I must insist that all passengers remain seated. For your safety, do not move about the cabin." Maya exhaled sharply, her frustration spilling over. "There's no turbulence. He's just making this up to get under your skin." "I know," Nadia said simply. "Then why don't you call him out on it?" Maya demanded. "Because that's what he wants," Nadia replied. "If I react, he wins. He gets to make me the problem." She picked up her glass of water. Her movements deliberate. Let him play his games. They won't save him. In the cockpit, Hank's fury simmered. He had expected something by now: anger, defiance, anything to justify the narrative he had built in his head. But Nadia's silence was louder than any protest. And it gnawed at him. "She's trying to make me look bad," he muttered, half to himself. Eric shook his head, his patience thinning. "Captain, you're doing that all on your own." Hank's head snapped toward him, his eyes blazing. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you're letting her get to you," Eric said, his voice firm. "And it's not a good look." Hank's nostrils flared. "You don't understand what's at stake here." "What's at stake," Eric replied, "is your career. If you keep this up." Hank didn't respond. He turned back to the controls, his mind racing. In the cabin, the tension reached a boiling point. Maya sat forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I can't take this anymore," she said. "He's pushing and pushing, and we're just sitting here." Nadia placed a hand on Maya's knee, her touch light but grounding. "He wants us to break," she said softly. "That's his goal. But if we stay calm, he'll be the one who breaks." As if on cue, the cockpit door swung open, and Hank stepped into the cabin. His presence was heavy, filling the space with unspoken hostility. Nadia looked up at him, her expression unreadable. She didn't move, didn't flinch. "Is there something I can help you with, Captain?" she asked, her voice steady. Hank's eyes narrowed. For a moment, he seemed to struggle for words. Then he spoke, his tone clipped. "Just checking to see if everything is satisfactory." "Everything is quite satisfactory," Nadia replied. Her calmness was like a mirror, reflecting his insecurity back at him. Hank's jaw tightened. He stood there for a moment longer, as if waiting for her to say more. When she didn't, he turned sharply and strode back to the cockpit, slamming the door behind him. Maya exhaled, her body tense. "What was that?" "That," Nadia said, "was a man losing control." Maya frowned. "What now?" "Now we wait," Nadia replied. Her voice was soft, but there was a quiet power in it. "He's going to overstep. They always do." In the cockpit, Hank's mind raced. He felt the walls closing in, the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. He couldn't shake the image of Nadia, her calmness infuriating him in ways he couldn't articulate. "She thinks she's untouchable," he muttered, "but no one is untouchable." Eric watched him silently, his unease growing. He could see the cracks in Hank's composure, the way his anger was consuming him. "Captain," Eric said cautiously, "you need to let this go." Hank didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the controls, but his mind was elsewhere, spiraling deeper into his frustration. Back in the cabin, Nadia closed her eyes for a moment, her expression serene. She had seen this before, the slow unraveling of a man who thought power meant control, who couldn't see that his own fear was his undoing. "He's close," she said softly. Maya looked at her, confused. "Close to what?" "To the point of no return," Nadia replied. And in the cockpit, Hank Warren was teetering on the edge, his own arrogance driving him toward a decision he couldn't take back. The plane moved steadily through the endless night, its engines purring with the kind of confidence that comes from flawless engineering. But inside, the humans were anything but flawless. The air in the cabin seemed heavier now, weighed down by tension so thick it could almost be touched. Nadia Harper remained calm, as she always did. Her hands rested lightly in her lap, her posture upright but not stiff, her breathing steady. It was a posture of quiet resilience, cultivated over years of navigating spaces where her presence was questioned, her worth underestimated. Across from her, Maya was anything but calm. She had stopped fidgeting, but the intensity in her eyes spoke volumes. "He's going to do something reckless," she whispered, her voice tight. "Yes," Nadia said softly. "And you're just going to let him?" Nadia turned her gaze toward Maya, her expression steady. "This isn't about what I let him do. It's about what he chooses to do. He's showing the world who he is. Maya. And when he finally reveals himself, there will be no coming back. In the cockpit, Hank Warren was unraveling. His hands gripped the control yoke tightly, his knuckles white against the leather. The camera feed still flickered in front of him, showing Nadia sitting in her seat, unmoved, unbothered. Her calmness was a provocation, her refusal to react a silent defiance that burned him to his core. She thinks she's so much better than everyone, he muttered, his voice low and venomous. Eric, the co-pilot, turned to him cautiously. Captain, I really think you need to step back from this. Step back? Hank snapped, his head whipping toward Eric. You don't understand what's happening here. No, Eric said evenly, his voice firmer now. I don't. All I see is a captain fixated on a passenger who hasn't done anything wrong. Hank's eyes narrowed. You think this is about her? This is bigger than her. This is about respect, about people knowing their place. Eric froze, the weight of Hank's words hanging in the air between them. Their place? He repeated, his voice quiet but sharp. And where exactly do you think her place is? Hank didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the controls, his jaw clenched. Back in the cabin, the tension was palpable. Even the attendants moved more cautiously now, their footsteps quieter, their eyes darting nervously toward the cockpit door. Maya leaned forward, her voice a low hiss. He's watching us. I can feel it. Let him watch, Nadia said calmly. But why? Maya demanded. Why let him keep pushing? Why not stop him? Because stopping him now would let him hide, Nadia said. Her voice was soft but carried a weight that silenced Maya's protests. He's already on the edge, Maya, and when he falls, everyone will see it. That's how change happens, not in the quiet, but in the breaking. In the cockpit, Hank was pacing now, his movements jerky and restless. Eric watched him warily, his own discomfort growing. Captain, you need to sit down, Eric said finally. I don't need you telling me what to do. Hank snapped. I'm not telling you, Eric replied. I'm asking, because right now, you're a danger to yourself and everyone on this plane. Hank froze, his eyes narrowing. What are you trying to say? Eric hesitated but didn't back down. I'm saying that this isn't about her. This is about you. Whatever you're trying to prove, you're risking everything to do it. And for what? To feel bigger? To feel in control? Hank's face darkened, his hands balling into fists. You don't know anything. I know enough, Eric said quietly. The plane dipped slightly, a barely noticeable shift, but enough to make the attendants glance nervously toward the cockpit. Maya noticed it too, her grip tightening on the armrest. What was that? She asked. Nadia remained calm. Nothing to worry about. How can you be so sure? Because I know how men like him work, Nadia said. He's losing control, but he won't risk his own safety. Not yet. Hank returned to his seat, his breathing uneven. His hands trembled as he gripped the yoke again. Though the autopilot still held steady, his mind raced, his thoughts circling the same bitter loop. She doesn't belong here, he muttered under his breath. Eric shot him a sharp look. Captain, that's enough. Enough? Hank turned to him, his voice rising. You don't get to tell me what's enough. I've been flying for decades. I've earned this seat. People like her don't just get to walk in and act like they're equal to me. Eric's eyes widened, the full weight of Hank's words settling over him. For a moment, he said nothing, the silence in the cockpit heavy and oppressive. Then, quietly but firmly, he spoke. She's not the one acting like she's better than anyone. That's all you. Hank stared at him, his face red with anger. But Eric didn't look away. The intercom crackled again, breaking the silence in the cabin. This is your captain. Hank's voice rang out, sharper now. We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. For your safety, I need all passengers to remain seated and secured. Maya looked at Nadia, her expression alarmed. That wasn't turbulence. He's doing something. Nadia's lips pressed into a thin line. He's testing limits. What do we do? Nothing, Nadia said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were sharp. Not yet. In the cockpit, Eric's patience finally snapped. Captain, you're going too far. This isn't just unprofessional, it's dangerous. Hank glared at him, his voice low and cold. If you can't handle this, maybe you're not cut out for this job. Eric didn't flinch. If you keep this up, you won't have a job left to worry about. The plane dipped again, more noticeably this time, and a few of the attendants stumbled, their hands gripping the backs of seats for balance. Maya's eyes widened, her knuckles white against the armrest. He's doing this on purpose, she whispered. Nadia didn't respond immediately. She closed her eyes briefly, her breathing slow and steady. Then she opened them, her gaze clear. It's time, she said. Time for what? Maya asked. For him to face the consequences. Nadia replied. Back in the cockpit, a soft chime interrupted the rising tension. A message blinked on the screen, its letters glowing faintly in the dim light. Incoming communication from owner's office. Immediate response required. Hank froze, his eyes fixed on the message. His hands hovered over the controls, his bravado crumbling as reality began to settle in. What is it? Eric asked, his tone cautious. Hank didn't answer. He stared at the screen, his face pale. He knew what the message meant. And in the cabin, Nadia knew it too. The jet cut through the sky, silent but for the faint whine of its engines. Yet inside, the silence was heavier, denser, carrying the weight of unspoken truths and gathering storms. The message from the owner's office blinked insistently on the cockpit screen, its sterile glow throwing Captain Hank Warren into stark relief. For a man so used to control, the sudden intrusion of accountability felt like an earthquake splitting the ground beneath him. Eric leaned closer to the message, his brow furrowed. Captain, you're going to have to answer that. Hank didn't respond immediately. His hands tightened on the yoke, though there was no reason to touch it. Autopilot held steady, but his grip was a lifeline, a tether to the authority he felt slipping through his fingers. Captain? Eric repeated, his tone firm now. Don't tell me what to do. Hank snapped, his voice sharp but hollow. Eric sat back, crossing his arms. It's not me telling you. That message isn't going away. You can't ignore it. Hank's jaw tightened as he stared at the blinking text. Immediate response required. The words seemed to pulse, each flash pulling him deeper into a truth he couldn't escape. In the cabin, Nadia Harper sat quietly, her reflection still and composed in the window. The soft glow of city lights far below illuminated her face. And for a moment, she appeared serene. But Maya knew better. He got a message, didn't he? Maya asked, her voice low. Nadia didn't turn from the window. Yes. How can you tell? Because men like him always think they're untouchable until they're not, Nadia said. Her voice was soft but resolute, a blade sheathed in calm. Maya tilted her head, her brow furrowed. You think it's about what he's been doing to us? I know it is, Nadia replied. She finally turned to face Maya, her gaze steady. When people like him push too far, they forget that someone is always watching. Always. Hank finally moved, his hand hovering over the communication panel. He hesitated, his breathing uneven. What are you waiting for? Eric asked, his tone clipped. Hank shot him a glare, but it lacked its usual force. I know what this is about. Then deal with it, Eric said, his patience thinning. Hank pressed the button, and the message opened. The text was simple, clinical, but it hit with the weight of a hammer. Captain Warren, upon arrival, you are to report immediately for debrief with Mr. Carter. Formal review of your conduct on this flight will commence. Prepare documentation of all actions taken during the flight. Eric read the message over Hank's shoulder. That's not good. Hank didn't respond. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. You've crossed a line, Captain, Eric continued, and they're not going to let it slide. Hank's hands clenched into fists. I've done nothing wrong. Eric let out a bitter laugh. You really believe that? After everything? I'm the captain of this plane, Hank said, his voice rising. I've earned this position. I don't need to explain myself to anyone. Especially not. He trailed off, his words hanging in the air like smoke. Especially not who? Eric asked, his voice low and sharp. Hank didn't answer. The plane dipped slightly as it began its descent. In the cabin, the attendants moved quietly, securing items and checking seatbelts. Their unease was palpable, their movements quicker and more deliberate than usual. Maya noticed it immediately. They're nervous, she said, glancing toward Nadia. They've seen what's happening, Nadia replied. They're just trying to stay out of it. Maya frowned. Do you think he'll try something else? Nadia's lips curved into a faint smile. He already has. That's why he got the message. In the cockpit, Hank stared out at the approaching city lights, his mind racing. He thought of everything he had done on this flight, the announcements, the condescension, the thinly veiled hostility, and for the first time, A flicker of doubt crept in, but it was quickly swallowed by his anger. "They're making this about her," he muttered, his voice low but bitter. Eric turned to him, his eyes hard. "No, Captain, you made it about her." Hank whipped his head around, his face flushed. "Watch your tone." "No," Eric said firmly. "Not this time. You've been out of line this entire flight. And now it's catching up to you. Don't put this on her. Own it." Hank glared at him, his chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. As the plane made its final approach, the tension in the cabin grew. Maya sat rigid in her seat, her eyes darting between Nadia and the window. "Do you think he'll lose his job?" Maya asked quietly. "That depends," Nadia said. "On what?" "On how much damage he's already done," Nadia replied, "and how much more he tries to do before this is over." The wheels touched down with a soft thud, the plane rolling smoothly along the runway. Outside, sleek black SUVs waited, their headlights cutting through the night. The attendants opened the cabin door, and the sound of the engines winding down filled the space. Maya glanced out the window, her brow furrowing. "Those cars, are they for us?" "No," Nadia said simply. Maya turned to her, confused. "Then who?" "They're for him," Nadia said. Her tone was calm, but there was a sharpness in her eyes. "This flight isn't over for him. It's just beginning." Hank watched the SUVs from the cockpit, his stomach sinking. He recognized the insignia on the doors, the crisp suits of the men stepping out. "They're here for you," Eric said quietly. Hank didn't respond. In the cabin, Nadia stood gracefully, smoothing her coat as she prepared to disembark. She moved with the same quiet confidence she had carried throughout the flight, unaffected by the storm that had raged around her. As she reached the door, one of the attendants hesitated. "Mrs. Harper, is there anything else we can do for you?" Nadia smiled gently. "No, thank you. You've done enough." She stepped onto the tarmac, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. Maya followed close behind, her gaze flicking nervously between Nadia and the approaching SUVs. "Do you think he knows what's coming?" Maya asked. "He knows," Nadia said. Inside the cockpit, Hank sat frozen as the men approached the plane. The faint knock on the door was almost polite, but it carried the weight of finality. Eric stood, his expression grim. "Good luck, Captain." He opened the door and stepped aside, letting the men in suits enter. "Captain Warren," one of them said, his tone crisp and professional. "We need to speak with you. Now." Hank's hands tightened on the yoke one last time before he finally let go. Outside, Nadia and Maya climbed into their waiting car, the door closing softly behind them. Maya let out a shaky breath, her tension finally releasing. "It's over," she said. Nadia turned to her, her gaze steady. "It's just beginning." As the car pulled away, the jet and its captain faded into the distance, swallowed by the night. The air on the tarmac was crisp, cutting through the night with a stillness that held its own gravity. The jet, its engines now silent, sat like a monument to a story unfolding inside. Nadia Harper stood near her car, watching the shadows move across the windows of the plane. She could feel the shift in the air, not just the literal descent from the sky, but something deeper, an unraveling. Maya stood beside her, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "I still can't believe it," she said, her voice low but charged. "You didn't even have to say anything. And now, this." Nadia smiled faintly, her expression calm but resolute. "That's the power they never see coming. They think power is loud. They think it's in control, in domination. They don't understand that sometimes power is silence, restraint." Maya looked at her, her brow furrowed. "But what happens now? Is this really the end for him?" "It depends," Nadia said softly, "on whether he learns anything from this." "Most don't." Inside the jet, Captain Hank Warren sat in the cockpit, staring at the men now seated across from him. Their suits were crisp, their expressions unreadable, but their presence left no doubt about their purpose. One of the men, the lead investigator from the owner's office, leaned forward. His voice was steady but carried an edge that left no room for argument. "Captain Warren, we've reviewed the preliminary reports from this flight. What we need from you now is your account of events." Hank shifted in his seat, his usual bravado now muted. "There's nothing to report," he said tightly. "It was a routine flight." The man's eyes narrowed. "Routine?" He set a tablet on the console in front of him. tapping the screen. This is the cabin audio from earlier in the flight. We've already heard it. Would you like to explain your remarks about turbulence? Or the repeated, unnecessary announcements directed at your passengers? Hank's face reddened. I was ensuring the safety of the flight. That's my job. The investigator's gaze didn't waver. Captain, this wasn't about safety. This was about control. In the car, Maya couldn't stop fidgeting. She glanced at Nadia, who was now scrolling through her phone. The glow of the screen soft against her composed face. How can you be so calm? Maya finally asked. He spent the whole flight trying to undermine you. And now, this. How are you not angry? Nadia lowered her phone, her gaze turning to the window. Oh, I'm angry, she said, her voice steady. But anger isn't always the answer. Especially not with men like him. Then what is? Time, Nadia said. Time exposes them. It lets the world see what they are without me ever having to lift a finger. That's more powerful than any argument I could make. Maya frowned, her frustration evident. I don't know how you do it. Nadia's lips curved into a faint smile. Because I've had to. Back on the jet, Hank's frustration finally boiled over. This is ridiculous, he snapped. I've been a pilot for decades. I've flown countless flights without a single incident. And now you're questioning my professionalism because of one passenger? Because she decided to sit there with that smug look on her face? The investigator raised an eyebrow. Smug? She was seated calmly in her chair. You, on the other hand, made multiple unnecessary announcements, left the cockpit mid-flight, and directed inappropriate remarks toward her assistant. Does that sound professional to you? Hank clenched his fists. She was provoking me. How, exactly? He faltered, his voice trailing off. He couldn't finish the sentence because there was nothing to say. Captain, the investigator said, his tone sharp now. The only person who was out of line on this flight was you. Outside, the SUVs began to pull away from the tarmac, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Maya watched them go, her brow furrowed. Do you think they're firing him right now? Probably, Nadia said. Good, Maya muttered. He deserves it. Nadia turned to her, her expression thoughtful. Maybe, but what he really deserves is a chance to understand why this happened. To learn from it. Do you think he will? Nadia paused, her gaze turning back to the jet. That's up to him. Hank sat alone now, the investigators having left the cockpit. The weight of their words hung heavy in the air. He stared at the controls in front of him, the familiar lights and dials suddenly feeling foreign. For years, he had defined himself by his position. The captain's seat had been his shield, his refuge, his proof that he was better, smarter, more deserving than the people he looked down on. But now, it felt like a trap, a cage built by his own arrogance. He thought of Nadia Harper, her calm, composed presence. She had done nothing, said nothing, and yet she had undone him completely. And that, more than anything, terrified him. In the car, Nadia leaned back in her seat, her eyes closing briefly. The night stretched ahead of them, quiet and still. Maya glanced at her, her voice softer now. Do you think it'll change anything? Him losing his job? It might, Nadia said, but real change doesn't happen overnight. It takes years of moments like this, of people being held accountable, of others seeing it happen and realizing it's possible. Maya nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. So, this is just one step. One of many, Nadia said. As the car disappeared into the night, the jet sat alone on the tarmac, its engines silent, and inside, Hank Warren sat in the captain's seat for the last time, finally forced to confront the emptiness of his power and the truth of his downfall.